Morning. My name is Jeff Schock. I'm the pastor here at Crossroads Church. I'm excited so many of you are here in person. Those of you who join us online. We are in the fifth week of a series looking at the 10 Commandments. And if you've been out over the last several weeks, you know that the 10 Commandments are they're foundational for Judaism. They're foundational for Christianity. Even so, a lot of Christians and even secular people don't really know how to regard them or how to view them or really what they mean. And so we wanted to, because they're so foundational, we wanted to take a look. And this week we are up to the fifth commandment, and that's you're going to find in Exodus chapter 20, verse 12. The fifth commandment is this: honor your father and your mother so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you. Honor your father and your mother. The place in the Bible you're going to find the most clear exposition of the fifth commandment is in Proverbs verse 23. And I'm going to read for us 12 through 16 and 22 through 25. This will be the passage on which today's teaching is based. Proverbs 23 verse 12. Apply your heart to instruction and your ears to words of knowledge. Do not withhold discipline from a child. If you punish them with the rod, they will not die. Punish them with the rod and save them from death. My son, if your heart is wise, then my heart will be glad indeed. My inmost being will rejoice when your lips speak what is right. Listen to your father who gave you life, and do not despise your mother when she is old. Buy the truth and do not sell it. Wisdom, instruction, and insight as well. The father of a righteous child has great joy. A man who fathers a wise son rejoices in him. May your father and mother rejoice. May she who gave you birth be joyful. People are always asking, what's wrong with the world? What's wrong with society? What's wrong with culture? I know over the last 2.5 years or so, I've just watched the news and asked those questions with renewed and burning urgency. Maybe you have too. And, the answers, depending on who you ask, it's always going to be like, well, it's failed social institutions, or it's these kind of regressive cultural things like systemic racism, or the haves oppressing the have-nots, or it's the breakdown of the family, right? And if you read the Bible, you know that it's both of those things. What's wrong with the world? And just a kind of brief look at this passage, Exodus chapter 20 says, and it gives you a kind of clue, honor your father and your mother so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you. You can look in Deuteronomy 4 for a kind of longer explanation of that verse, but what it's not saying is this: if you honor your father and mother, you will have a long life. Statistics just don't bear that out. There are plenty of people who honor their father and their mother and they died young. What this does mean is that if you honor your parents, if the nuclear family is upheld as a building block of larger society, that society will thrive. And if you don't, it will not. It will disintegrate. And just by way of kind of a counterexample to this, if you look at some of the classic totalitarian regimes throughout our modern history, one of the things that they will do is they will try to undermine the nuclear family. You can look in places like communist China or even Nazi Germany, and one of the things that they will do is totalitarian regimes will they'll undercut the family, and so you get to the point where family members are perhaps selling out and betraying other family members as political dissidents or something like that. You have stuff like the Hitler Youth rising up, and this was an effort to seek to undermine traditional family values, right? It could be said that a society that lets family unravel supports its own demise. Augustine, one of the church fathers, famously said, if anyone fails to honor his parents, is there anyone he will spare? Now, if you think about it, it makes perfect sense. Our family is the first institution. It's the first social structure that we're a part of. And it's the thing that teaches us what? Deference to authority. It's the thing that teaches us to subordinate our own individual needs for maybe a collective good. It teaches us how to respond to discipline, right? And chances are, if you've ever encountered somebody who was especially helpful, who was honorable, who had good character, who was hardworking, who was ethical and moral, chances are you can probably thank their parents. One of the books that I've been reading to prepare for this series is Kevin DeYoung's book on the 10 Commandments, and he writes this: The parental relationship is the first and most important relationship. It shapes all other relationships. When you come across a kind, considerate, capable student in your class, if you're a teacher in high school or a student in college, or come across someone in your workplace who seems hardworking, conscientious, responsible, and considerate, more often than not, you owe a great gratitude to that person's parents. How it goes with the family is how it goes with society. Our larger culture is dependent upon our nuclear families as kind of like the bedrock. All of us come from families, good, bad, maybe in the middle somewhere. Not all of us have kids, but all of us have parents. And so this commandment has kind of a universal applicability for our own lives and then also for like our larger culture. Unbelievably important. Now, a family is the first place where you'll learn to experience things like unselfishness, and it's also the first place where you're ever going to experience unconditional love. And the 10 Commandments, we've been saying all along that scholars call them the Decalogue, the 10 words. And traditionally, people see them on like 2 tablets, if you've seen it portrayed in the movies. The word is actually, they're on 2 tables. And I think oftentimes we assume that maybe there were 5 on one and 5 on the other one. That's not how it went. They put all 10 on both of them. One of them went in the ark, and the other one they kept around so they could read it. And it has been said that the 5th commandment represents a kind of bridge between the first 4 and the succeeding 6. The first 4 all have to do with your relationship to God, right? Have no other gods before him. Don't worship false images, etc. And then the subsequent, the last 5 through 10 are all about how we treat people. This 5th commandment, being the first in that order of how we treat people, says, honor your father and mother. Well, it's foundational. Of course it is. And I'll be hyperbolic to just prove my point. Chances are, if you find somebody who has upheld this first commandment, they're not going to be the people who violate commandments 6, 7, and 8, right? You're going to, it's not all the time, but most of the time, if you have people who honor their parents, they're not the murderers. Right? A lot of times if you have people with dysfunctional family relationships, that's when you kind of see some of the worst in human behavior. Not all the time, but most of the time. We'll talk about that in a minute. So all of life, you can boil down to these 10 principles. And the first one that has to deal with how we relate to people deals with how we relate to our family. And here we got Proverbs 23 as this exposition of this commandment and what it's supposed to look like. Here's the deal. Rivers of ink have been spilled talking about the relationships between parents and kids and parents and gosh, how to overcome the psychological damage that arises out of those relationships. Rivers of ink have been spilled, so I can't address all of it. But I do want to hit some wave tops here because, again, this has a sort of universal applicability, right? So we want to ask 2 questions. What is a family? And then what are its operating principles? What is a family? And what are its operating principles? Now, Timothy Keller, teaching on this particular commandment, he had a great definition for family. I'll share it with us. He said this: a family is a learning community built on a covenant of lifetime loyalty. I couldn't think of a better definition, so I'll quote his. I'll say it again. A family is a learning community built on a covenant of lifetime loyalty. Now, this is, it's in the Bible, so we tend to assume that this is the traditional view of family, but it's not. The traditional view of family is quite different. The traditional view of family is not necessarily covenant-based, it's genetics-based. It is blood, right? And this is why in some areas that don't have maybe the legacy of Victorian Christianity that we have here in the West, places like China, places like the Middle East, adoption isn't like a thing that they do. Because it's all about the blood. It's all about genetics. I have friends who were adopted children in places around the world, developing countries, and they were always treated in some respects like second-class citizens. They never enjoyed the full provision of son or daughtership in that context, right? The traditional view, it's all about blood. This is something different. This is a covenant. I'm going to explain what that is in just a moment. Now, it's also different than the modern view of a family. The modern view of a family, and I don't want to sound dismissive, but the modern view of a family kind of goes something like this. Well, if you self-identify as a family, then you're a family, right? Oh, we just if you say you're a family, you're a family. If maybe you signed a 2-year lease together, now you're a family. The Bible says something very different about a family. The Bible says a family is a lifelong covenant. Now, what's a covenant? A covenant is a legal contract that is far more loving than a simple legal contract. All right, it is also far more binding than what you think of traditionally when we think of like a love affair. All right, all right. So I'll talk to people all the time, young people, and they say they're not married, and they say, well, what does it matter? We love each other. We're living together. Why do we need that piece? It's just a piece of paper, right? And I will say, well, if it's just a piece of paper, why don't you have one, right? And the answer is because one of you doesn't love the other person enough to become that vulnerable with them. That's the answer. One of you doesn't love the other person enough to become that vulnerable. Why is it vulnerable? Because it is an endless lifetime commitment to that person. A family, another way of saying it, a family are the people you're stuck with, right? A family are the people you're stuck with. The relationship between parents and children is a lifelong teaching, covenantal teaching community with lifetime loyalty. These are people that you become, it's till death do us part, right? You only get, well, not always one set of parents, but your parents are your parents, your kids are your kids. And it is an endless lifetime commitment, okay? Now, the difference between a marriage covenant and a family covenant is this. In a marriage, your relationship to your spouse doesn't really change the way it does with your relationship with your kids. The relationships with your kids and parents is far more dynamic comparatively, and here's the thing. Because when you're a child, when you're of a certain age, you're under your parents' authority. You're supposed to listen to your parents. You're supposed to obey your parents. And parents, when your kids are little, you're supposed to exercise authority, and you're supposed to teach your children, etc. But the relationship changes, doesn't it? You're going to get to a certain age, and parents, if you got teenagers, I'm starting to see the window kind of close at this point about how much instruction and authority you have over them. At some point, you kind of let go, and it's like when you teach them how to ride a bike. Eventually, you let the bike go. And so the relationship with parents and kids changes. If you have adult kids, you know that you don't exercise authority in their life the same way you did when they were 6. And by the same token, you should not expect the same level of obedience as when they were 6. If you have like adult children, you can't call them and tell them to make sure they wear the blue shirt with the collar because they look good in that one. You just can't do it anymore, right? Now, that's what a family is. What are the operating principles? How does it work? So two parts. First, we're going to talk about the operating principle for parents. And then we're going to talk about kids, all right? Parents, verse 15, my son, if your heart is wise, then my heart will be glad indeed. And then verse 12, this is to kids, apply your heart to instruction and your ears to words of knowledge. It is a learning community. A family is a learning community, and it is meant and purpose for teaching your children the moral order of the universe. The chief purpose of being a parent, the relationship, is to teach your kids to what? To see that their heart is wise. You want a child whose heart is wise. Now, this again stands at variance to both the traditional and the modern paradigms of parenting. The traditional paradigm of parenting, and you'll recognize this if you've read the Hebrew scriptures or you're familiar with any other like ancient literature. This is how it goes. You have kids. Why? Because you need help on the farm. You need protection from marauders. You have kids because there's a utilitarian reason for kids. And in a lot of cultures to this day, you'll still see that it's about it's more about control and power. In some senses, parents own their kids. Right? You can sell them in some cultures to this day. This is not what's in view here. Nor is the modern view of parenting what is in view either. The modern view of parenting is this, and this was kind of made popular in the 70s and 80s. There was a dearth of academic literature being written about, and it was mostly directed at poor communities. And some of you who are in education will recognize it. And this was the sentiment. It said, what you need to do as parents is create a warm, loving environment for your kids. Don't try to impose your views on them. Rather, just let them grow up and discover and be whoever it is they're going to be. It would be wrong for you to somehow, try to inculcate your morals and your beliefs on your child. What you got to do is just raise them in a warm, nurturing environment and give them over to the social institutions and let the experts do it. Have you heard that? Because that's what has shaped the last several generations of kind of public education in the West and so on, and that's a pretty popular sentiment to this day. I have to tell you, it stands at great variance to God's will for family. The primary teacher in a child's life is supposed to be their parents. It is our responsibility as parents to teach kids what the moral order of the universe is, what is important, what is worth living for, what is worth dying for, what are the salient guiding principles of your life. If you're a parent and there are some things that you believe in your bones, you have a responsibility to share that with your kids. We cannot, as parents, all right, all of us who are parents, maybe some of you aren't parents yet, could happen. You cannot try to outsource discipling your kids to the quote-unquote experts. It's not supposed to work that way. Your chief principal occupation as a parent is a teacher. And look, you see in this text, you see the example of loving a child and disciplining a child. And those are means to an end, not an end in and of themselves. You love a child and you discipline a child and you exercise authority over a child. Why? So that you can teach them, so that you can make them wise. When I think about my kids, I have 4 boys at various stages of development. And boy, is it an interesting little sociological experiment going on in my house. But the thing I want for them, as I was researching the message this week, and I was thinking about all the hopes and dreams I had for my kids, I still remember the day I held Jake in the hospital. You can believe he was ever that big. And I still have a picture somewhere of me holding him, my first moments ever as a father. And in that moment, I immediately had dreams for my kids. There are things I wanted for him. And as he has grown and as all of my kids have grown, those dreams, they haven't diminished. If anything, I've added to them. I have all kinds of hopes and aspirations and things I want for my kids. This week, I was doing a little soul searching, and I was thinking about the pathology of those dreams. And so most of them are into sports. And so I've got all kinds of dreams related to their athletic pursuits. And what do I want? I want them to be a part of a sports team so that they can learn teamwork and cooperation. I want them to experience the kind of adversity that you get from athletics so they can develop grit and perseverance. I want them to have the kind of confidence that you would expect people to get from athletics so that they'll be able to walk into a boardroom or a courtroom or whatever venue they find themselves in one day and be able to carry that confidence with them. What do I want? I want them to be wise. In my heart of hearts, I want them to be wise. I want them to do good in school. They're, high school, junior high, middle school, wherever they're at. Look, there's not a whole lot of really super valuable information you learn in high school. Can we just admit that? All right? But what do you learn? You learn how to submit to authority. You learn how to learn. You learn self-discipline and the practices that you're going to need to succeed in life, going to college and be effective in the workplace. What am I really wishing for? I'm wishing for them to be wise. I want them to know some stuff. That is the prayer behind all the prayers. That is a hope behind all the hopes. I want them to be wise. And what does it say? Verse 15, and my heart will be glad. There's nothing more I can think of for my kids. No better dream, no better ambition than to have them be wise. Now, there are plenty of folks who will step back and say, I have failed as a parent because my kids have rejected my views. They've rejected my paradigm of looking at the universe. They've rejected my values, and so I've failed as a parent. And that is not true. You are responsible for the effort and not the outcome. If you have children and you taught them, you brought them to church, you taught them, you told them what's worth living for, you hit the high points, you did your best to teach them, and then they walked in a different direction, that you were faithful. You're responsible for the effort and not the outcome. Your responsibility is to teach them, and if they rejected the teaching, you haven't failed as a parent. Now, the purpose of teaching is to get a child. The whole point of teaching a child, the whole point of being a parent is to get a kid to the point where they don't need you to tell the difference between right and wrong. That's the whole point. The whole point, that 16, 18, 20 years, whatever, however long it is for you, and they're all on different tracks, let me tell you, the whole point is to get them to a place where they don't need you to tell the difference between right and wrong. Now, here it says, Colossians, it says, spare the rod, spoil the child. In Colossians 3:21, it says this: fathers, do not embitter your children, or they will become discouraged. The word embitter is, it's the same word we get for a boxing match. And so there's a point here. This is loving discipline. And so the Marines is good at discipline, and they can teach you a lot of stuff. I remember I was quite surprised in basic training. They stuff you full of 500 hours of history. There's all kinds of random facts I know about like a little obscure branch of the military. And because they'll set it up. They architect the whole situation just to cram you full of knowledge. They're really good at the discipline aspect. But you know what? There's no love at all. In fact, we're affectionately referred to as bullet catchers. That is not a love relationship, okay? But to have the type of teaching relationship you see here, it is equal parts love and discipline. It is loving discipline. And when it says, do not embitter your children, it's like don't antagonize them. Don't fight with them. Don't create a boxing match where there doesn't need to be one. All right? Martin Luther, who had a notoriously, he was German, and I'm German. Schock is a German name. My father is a German dude. So I don't know if this is all Germans, but it was my dad and it was Luther's dad. And they tend to be pretty strong on discipline. And Luther's dad was very heavy-handed on discipline, not very heavy-handed on emotional warmth. Luther said this. He said, spare the rod and spoil the child. Yes, it is true, but keep an apple to give him when he does well. All right. So parents, the responsibility is to teach your children. I've been thinking of Crosby, Stills, and Nash song all week. And that song is true because the second stanza goes like, you have to teach your parents. And that's the second part, children. Children, it says, honor your father and mother. It doesn't say obey. When you're little, you obey. But the honor that you owe your parents is lifelong. There will never be a point in time that does not require you to honor your parents. Now, there's a reason it doesn't say love your mother and father. And I know this is a lot of people's story, and maybe your parents weren't awesome. Maybe your parents were just evil. Love is an emotion. If it said love your father and mother, there's some of us in this room that would be nearly impossible to do that because of what they did to you. Love is an emotion. Honor is a moral choice. You can always honor your parents. In Matthew 19, we have where Jesus says, if somebody strikes you, turn the other cheek. This is the Christian non-retaliation ethic. And it's one of the more difficult aspects of the faith, frankly, but here's the thing. If you have encountered the grace of God, if you consider yourself a Christian walking in the footsteps of Jesus, and your parents treated you terribly, there is a fundamental posture of the Christian faith that says you can forgive the worst in other people because of Jesus and because of his blood. God has forgiven the worst in you. And so there is a call, I think, on any one of us that maybe you think of your family of origin and it's just pain. There's a fundamental call on all of us to turn the other cheek and honor your father and mother, irrespective of the pain, irrespective of the hardship, irrespective of what they did. We're all called to turn the other cheek and honor our father and mother. It's a moral choice. Love, that would be a challenge. That would be nearly impossible in some respects. And it might be that you need to have well thought out barriers if there's an abusive relationship or something like that. But the Bible does not, it doesn't say that if you didn't have the most awesome childhood, you don't have to honor your parents. You have to honor your father and mother. Now, when you honor your parents, you honor God. Now, the second thing for kids, I say kids, people give me a hard time. I guess there was a point in time where kids was derogatory. I think kids, children, okay? Something else children need to do, the final thing children need to do is to grow up. Kids need to grow up. Verse 15, if your heart is wise, then my heart will be glad. And then 22, listen to your father who gave you life, and do not despise your mother when she is old. You got to grow up. And my wife and I had vastly different childhoods. She was raised in an intact nuclear family with two loving parents who were Christians. Her dad's a pastor. He's taught here. He's one of my great mentors and friends. And I used to joke around when I first started dating Allie. It was really my first exposure to like a not dysfunctional family. And some of you are old enough to remember the TV show Seventh Heaven. Do you remember this? It was a sitcom about a pastor and his family. And I thought it was just really comical that in her household, it was a lot like the sitcom. Everything was resolved in 45 minutes with commercials. It was so quaint and peaceable compared to my family of origin, which I had a humdinger. Some of you will empathize with it. I grew up in a not Christian home. There's a lot of abuse and so on. So Allie and I have these two very radically different stories. But we're talking about this, and there's hardly a person. I'm willing to bet. I'm willing to bet that there's hardly a person in here who got to adulthood without the sense that they weren't loved perfectly, right? Even my wife with her kind of like a really beautiful family, and I mean they have their issues, but it was just wonderful by comparison to mine. But even there, she's acutely aware of the fact that her parents, they, in some senses, might have been heavy-handed with the discipline, or not emotionally warm enough in some cases. And so even in a pristine, idyllic family, there's still, you're going to get to adulthood, and you're going to be aware of a kind of wound that you weren't loved perfectly. And it's somewhat universal. I mean, if there's anyone in here that doesn't have that kind of wound, I want to hear from you after church just to know that you exist. All right? It seems to be somewhat universal. No parent has ever loved their kid perfectly, and so all of us have an acute awareness that we weren't loved perfectly. But here's the thing. If you are going to grow up, to truly be wise, right? To be wise, if your heart is wise, then my heart will be glad indeed, right? If you're going to be wise, you have to understand the gospel of grace. That's what ultimately makes you wise. It's what ultimately allows you to honor your parents, even if they weren't awesome. You need to understand the gospel of grace. In John 17, Jesus prays a priestly prayer, and it's one of my favorite passages in all the scriptures because he is praying for his disciples, but then he is praying for those who would hear about the message through them. He's praying for me. He's praying for you. And this is his prayer. It says in John 17, verse 20, my prayer is not for them alone. I pray also for those who will believe in me through their message, that all of them may be one, Father, just as you are in me and I am in you. May they also be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. I have given them the glory that you gave me, that they may be one as we are one, I in them and you in me, so that they may be brought to complete unity. Then the world will know that you sent me and have loved them, even as you have loved me. If I can paraphrase, this is Jesus praying to God. And what's hanging in the margins here is what makes up a family, and it's a covenant. He's saying, Father, I am the only natural child you have down here. But my friends, these people who've believed in me, I want you to love them as you've loved me. Now, we can just read right over that and maybe it won't penetrate, but I promise you, you can stare at this and it is like a mountain that is so high you can't see the top of it. You can spend the rest of your life trying to glimpse the totality of this statement that Jesus prayed to God the Father, and he said about you, they're not your natural child. This isn't your natural child. There is no blood loyalty here, but because they believe in me, because they're my friends and I love them, will you love them like you love me? This is Jesus' prayer for you. So that when God looks at you, all the admiration he has towards Jesus for the work that he did on the cross, every last ounce of pride and satisfaction and joy that God has in Jesus Christ for paying for the sins of the world and conquering hell and death, he has towards you. Now, here's the deal. Not all of us have perfect parents. And that's my story. I came from a broken home. And statistically, and those of you who, you read, that if you come from a broken home, chances are you're going to end up perpetuating that cycle of brokenness. But that is not my story. Because the gospel of grace, because of the saving love of Jesus Christ, now I have a resource for loving my kids and teaching my kids and giving them the knowledge to be wise. One day my heart is going to rejoice because they're going to be wise. All of a sudden, the love of God has the ability to break these chains of like systemic and generational sin. And look, John 1, verse 12 says this, "Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God." So the family of God is not, it's not simply based on genetics. There is a covenant. And if you believe in Jesus Christ, he will never leave you or forsake you. And I know there's a lot of us who have parents who are aging. And irrespective of what your relationship with them has been, there's a lot of us who are, you're acutely aware that you're not going to have parents, earthly parents forever. But you have a Father in heaven who loves you, who will do anything for you, who has done anything for you, to know you, to adopt you, to call you a son and a daughter. And here's the thing, you can get to adulthood, and if you did not receive enough emotional warmth from your parents, or maybe if you didn't even receive enough loving discipline from your parents, you could be very drastically unsure of who you are. You can walk around and maybe you can put up a good front, but you'd be tremendously insecure on the inside if maybe you didn't have great parents. But I have to tell you, if you can internalize the gospel of Jesus Christ, that you have a Father in heaven and he gave the thing that was most precious to him, his son, to know you in a personal way, to call you a son or a daughter, to be adopted into his family. Well, now you've got a resource for honoring your parents. You got a resource. You have something to teach your kids so that they'll be wise. And one day your heart will rejoice because the gospel is the beginning of all knowledge. Let me pray.